Did you know that almost every bite of food we eat depends on a bee? Welcome back to Rooted and Restless. I'm Marianne Smith Edge, your host. It's summer, the flowers are in bloom, and the bees are buzzing. But did we really think about the bees really affect what we eat or not? Well, my guest today can really give us insight on the connection between bees, pollinators, and the food we eat. I'm so pleased to have Dr. Tamara Horn Potter, the beekeeper extension specialist for Kentucky State University in Frankfort, Kentucky. Had the privilege of meeting Tamara over the last couple of years at some Kentucky Agricultural Council meetings, and I can say that her passion and knowledge of bees is really quite contagious. So, Tammy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
June is National Pollinator Month, and of course, there's definitely weeks to celebrate that. And I have used bees and pollinators interchangeably, but there's more than just bees that are pollinators. So, Tammy, give us a little bit more insight to really explore that whole area.
Sure. So many people are familiar with honeybees being pollinators because they provide the seed set for all of those specialty crops that you were talking about, our watermelons and our apples and oranges and cucumbers. But then we also have hummingbirds are a pollinator. They tend to be migratory, so they will go down to Central America in the wintertime, and we don't see them then. But now, of course, they have returned to Kentucky and the region, and they do provide some seed set. Butterflies are also pollinators. Many of us are enamored with monarch butterflies. They too are also migratory, and they will overwinter in Mexico. So during the winter months, of course, we don't see these particular types of pollinators. And then even bats tend to be pollinators west of the Mississippi. East of the Mississippi, the bats do get their protein needs from other insects and things. So the east, like I said, east of the Mississippi, the bats are not pollinators, but certainly west of the Mississippi, they are. They have developed very specialized relationships with certain flowers. Those bats, like in Arizona and New Mexico, have. And so those host species of flowers depend upon those bats. And so wide variety of pollinators, not just bees, wide variety.
So we really do need to feed those hummingbirds in our backyard.
Absolutely.
So tell me, how did you get into being a beekeeper specialist?
So I tell people I'm an example of somebody whose hobby became a career. And it was a dog-legged path. I was fortunate to grow up on a farm, and I had farmers on both sides of my family, and in particular, we had pigs. And in the 80s, I don't know how many of your audience will remember, but the bottom dropped out of the pig market. I mean, it was pretty brutal. And so I had decided when I went to college, I did not want to have any part of that life. But we had massive gardens. And so I was privileged to have access to, the tomatoes and corn and beans and mustard greens and things like that. That formed my childhood. But I decided to become an English professor. And it wasn't until my grandfather had Parkinson's in 1997, he needed an extra pair of hands to work his 60 colonies of bees. And so I got roped into helping him. And I initially told him I would help him one day. And I was just, opening that first hive was such an experience, and everything that I had not expected. I had assumed that the bees would just come flooding out of the hive and intent on stinging me, which of course didn't happen. And from that point forward, I spent the rest of the summer in 1997 helping him and just learning more and more about the division of labor among the bees in the hive, the specific types of plants that provide nectar and pollen for the bees. Everything was it was a new window into how the world operated. And I kept walking toward it and I never looked back. Um, and so I ended up finally going to work in the queen bee industry in Hawaii because I was having difficulty learning some of the basic skills to be a beekeeper. And and so in I guess it was 2007 to 2006 to 2010. I worked in the wintertime on the Big Island helping queens make queens. And then that set me up then to become the state apiarist for Kentucky Department of Ag for 10 years. So, like I said, it's been a dog-legged path, but one that I've enjoyed.
Well, just a little bit of exposure that I've had to bees, and yes, we have actually had beehives in our backyard, but that's a story for another time. And some of them did get under my husband's netting, so that created a little excitement at times. But you're right. Having seen bees in various areas, and when I've been in New Zealand, it's all very fascinating, as you say, and to really learn. So, with your knowledge and background, and I think you mentioned the importance of bees, of course, with specialty crops, but just if you've never been around bees, you may not really understand what that connection or how, quote, bees work to pollinate some of the crops. So give us a little insight, how that magic, quote, happens.
Sure. So, uh, bees have a lot of different types of hair on their bodies. In fact, when we're talking to general audiences, somebody will say, "Well, how do I tell the difference between a bee and a wasp?" And it's always hair. And they have sometimes the hair on the legs can look like a comb, like James Dean in the 50s would use in the movies. And then sometimes it's long, silky hair, so that they can pick up grains of pollen that are maybe in the air. And they develop these different types of hair to take advantage of a flower's ability to produce a type of dust. Aristotle called it a life-giving dust that we call pollen. Okay. And pollen is the fingerprint of a flower, right? Each flower will
Right.
produce its own type of pollen, but it's again, it's the male genetic packet of a flower. And because flowers are rooted, they can't get up and go on a date with another flower. They need the bees to provide that transport of genetic material. And so that's where the hair of a bee will come into place. Bees are vegetarian. They do not eat other insects for their protein needs. They eat that pollen, and the pollen will adhere to the hair on the bees, and they take that back to the hive. But but in the process of that exchange taking place, too, the pollen will also move with other flowers and sometimes within its own flower. So that when we're talking about seed set, economists are counting on that exchange happening. And if you look at a crop like almonds, which 100% depend upon honeybees to provide seed set, that's what we're counting. And any type of weather-related crisis that impacts whether honeybees can fly to those almond trees impacts seed set. So if a massive flooding event happens and a beekeeper can't get his hives to an almond orchard, then there's zero seed set. There's zero almonds. And that impacts prices at the market, right? If you have
Right.
any type of weather or flooding in Florida is another good example. If we get a hurricane that impacts our commercial beekeepers, then we get reduced seed set and prices at the market will reflect that. They go higher.
Well, when we talk about flooding, I think and even with my ag background, you don't automatically you think flooding, okay, crops, but you don't think the impact of a bee, as you just talked about. And I also think it's kind of interesting. I've read that, I mean, there's probably more beekeepers, but there's only about five or so really large bee, I'll call them keepers, and you can give me more insight that that actually transport bees to crops, and so give me a little insight, because the reality is you just don't have bees hanging around. I mean, you may have some, but not enough for some of the pollination that you mentioned.
So what you're asking about the migratory beekeepers, and you're
Right.
right. Only 5% of our beekeepers are in that very small minority of migratory beekeepers because it is a difficult life. It is a typically blue collar life. These are fourth and fifth generation beekeepers, and they've developed long-standing contracts with their specialty crop producers. A lot of times those contracts are just, a handshake. They're not written down. I think probably now in 2026, they're beginning to be written down, but that is how long term these arrangements have been in place. And anytime there is a weather crisis, like I said, a hurricane in Louisiana or Florida, sometimes when I was a state apiarist, the beekeepers could only give me 48 hours notice that they were moving their bees from Louisiana into Western Kentucky to get out of harm's way. And I needed to be there to be able to do an inspection, and just know that those hives aren't bringing back disease into our state. Um, so, so there's a structure in place with the commercial beekeepers, and we call it a triangle, a migratory triangle. And it's all determined by floral bloom. And so a beekeeper can start in Florida working strawberries and then have his bees in Maryland pollinating watermelon and end up in Maine working the blueberry season or some other type of crop. In the West, that tends to start in California in February with almonds, and then they'll run their bees up to Washington to work the cherries and apples, and then take their hives to South Dakota to work clover. And that closes out that triangle. But we call it following the bloom. And there was a great book in 1991 written by Douglas Wynot called Following the Bloom. And it deals with some of the stresses that that particular type of industry can have on family life, because you're having to homeschool your children, or a lot of times those commercial beekeepers are running their hives on flatbed trucks from, you know, 12 midnight until 4 in the morning. So there's accidents, fatalities sometimes. Um, but it's how our industrial agriculture for specialty crops survives, right? It depends upon this 5% group of beekeepers.
And that's, I think, is something, thank you for explaining it, because the reality is, general public don't realize that. So I want to talk a little bit about agricultural practices, but I'm curious because not only is it a hard life for the beekeepers, but how do we, it's also has to be somewhat of a hard life for some of the bees. So how do you keep the bees healthy? And as you said, you have to be mindful when you're the transportation and transforming from states to state, not only keeping the bees healthy, but making sure that there's not any disease coming into another state.
Sure. So, in drought conditions, sometimes what one beekeeper, commercial beekeeper that I work with will do, in addition to say, two flatbed trucks filled with 450 hives each, he will send a separate flatbed truck filled with just water, right? So that they can make sure that those bees have access to water while they are going from Florida to California. Um, Sometimes, and that lets him keep control of the quality of water, because we maybe assume that water quality is the same across all states, which of course it is not. And bees are very sensitive to those differences, right? They absolutely have to have water in order to be able to thermoregulate when the temperatures are super high. If they don't have access to water, then they can very well cook in those hives. Not unusual at all for that to happen. They also, bees, while they are in transit, can be exposed, as you, I'm sure, are aware, to all types of volatiles in the air. And what I mean by that are people who may be applying chemicals. They can certainly face that while they are in transit. And then another factor, I don't want to call it a hazard, because being an inspector, I respect other inspectors, but when they get to the California border, sometimes there are changes in what the inspectors are wanting, and they're very sensitive, say, to fire ants coming from Texas, right? So
Right.
if they see one fire ant on a hive, then that entire truck has to be pulled over and put in quarantine, for a week or two, and make sure that every single hive has been checked so that they're not bringing fire ants into California. And those changes, those regulatory changes can happen very suddenly, right? I mean, from the time that the commercial beekeeper leaves Florida, he may think that he is following all of the laws in California, and then he gets to the border and it's like, uh-oh. So, so those are just some of the things that a commercial beekeeper will have to navigate. And every year it's a different ball game. And some years, of course, bees are succumbing to viruses, right? Because they fly,
Right.
right? And when they fly, then viruses can spread very quickly. And so uh, it's a challenging career for a commercial beekeeper. I take my hat off to them because, you know, our country has the most diverse food system in place for our citizens, and we take it for granted. And
Right.
we never ever see the real work that goes into place. I like to quote an editor from the 1950s. He said, beekeepers are the stepchildren of agriculture, right?
That's a perfect quote, because all the time I talk about food, and this is probably the first time I've ever really. It's great because the reality, when you really explain it, if we didn't have beekeepers and bees, where would we be? Especially with the specialty crops. So it's all about being good to bees. Now let's hear from Mindy Herman, registered dietitian, food and nutrition writer, and the guru on all the latest food trends.
Hi, Marianne. Pollinator Week, this year on June 22nd through 28th, celebrates the importance of bees, along with other pollinators, in sustaining ecosystems, biodiversity, and the global food supply. Here in the U.S., we have more than 4,000 types of wild bees, with honeybees as the main pollinators for commercial food crops. According to USDA, more than 100 U.S.-grown crops rely on pollinators, with bees pollinating about 3/4 of fruit, nuts, and vegetables grown in the U.S. The added revenue to crop production from pollinators is valued at $18 billion. Commercially, there are nearly 3 million managed honeybee colonies in the U.S. Sadly, up to half the bee colonies die off every year because of changes in habitats, diseases, and bee parasites, and weather trends changes like warmer winters, earlier springs, and droughts can change the flowering patterns of plants that bees rely on for their all-important pollen.
Now, let's return to our conversation. In regards to that, I mean, you've talked about some of the environmental impacts, natural impacts, and we know there's definitely been a lot more focus over the years in agricultural practices to obviously promote pollinators and bees. So, from your standpoint, what has occurred over the last several years to promote and at the same time some of the risk that we know exist as well?
So I'm going to start with the good first, right? So in 1996, the USDA put in place a way for farmers and landowners to convert some of their existing acreages into pollinator habitat. And in my opinion, this has been a great success. It's probably, and again, my opinion, the most important land use change since we put in place programs to help land ownership in the 1930s recover from the Great Depression, right?
Wow.
Um, those programs are the Conservation Reserve Program with the Farm Services Agency, and then the EQIP program with NRCS. And there's some differences between the two, and I don't want to, your audience may not want to get into the weeds on those, but both of them require a 50-50 match. In other words, the landowner or the farmer will put up 50% of the cost of converting those acreages to pollinator habitat, and then the federal government picks up the other half. So, that program, both of those have been enormously successful, I think, and to keep our numbers as stable as they have been of active working beehives. We need more of them, there's no question, but at least we have a federal policy in place to help that. The Farm Bill, I don't understand why. Why?
There's a lot of whys in those. So.
I do not understand why we go years without having an approved farm bill in place. I'll just leave that there. But having said that, in 2014, the farm bill that was finally approved then had funds for the majority of states to take beekeeping samples of, not just the bees, but pollen and beeswax. And that gave us real data that could show what types of agricultural chemicals those bees could inadvertently be bringing back to the hives. And what I found in our state, which is Kentucky, is that, other than beekeeper applied miticides, which at this point in time we need to apply, our state fared fairly well in terms of what the beeswax was showing us. In other words, it didn't seem like there was just tons and tons of agricultural chemicals that were impacting the bees in our state. But you take a state like California, which is industrial agriculture, some of the samples were showing 17, 16 different types of agricultural chemicals in the pollen. And that is a lot. That's a lot. Now then, so we're still waiting, I think. I think maybe the Farm Bill is sitting in the House of Representatives right now. I don't know if it's been sent to the Senate or not. Don't quote me on that, but it's making its way through the system. But one thing that concerns me, these past 2 years has been the decision to shutter one of our USDA bee labs, which is located in Beltsville, Maryland. Now, this is a bee lab that has been providing free services to all of our beekeepers in the nation at, again, no cost, right? Disease studies, analysis. If a beekeeper has a problem in a hive and that person wants to send a frame to Beltsville, the staff at that bee lab would analyze those samples and get that beekeeper back some information. And that is being shuttered. And every person there is being redeployed to our remaining three USDA federal bee labs, right? So
Right.
you look at our industrial agricultural economy in this country, and we have gone since the 1980s from 8 federal USDA bee labs. Now we are down to 3. And the one in Beltsville had been in place since what, 1900s, 1910?
Yes, Beltsville with all their research. Yeah, that's kind of like the original research in that regard. So I think you've definitely put out some challenges there, even though I'd like to say that integrated pest management for farmers have become better, and I think you alluded to that.
Absolutely.
The aspect is you still need that other research and lab work to ensure that, because at the end of the day, what you just said, if we don't have all that knowledge, and we need to keep the bees alive and healthy to keep the food growing.
Sure. So, and to recap, I mean, honeybees just by themselves, I mean, I'm not talking about the other pollinators, just by themselves contribute over 30 billion in either direct seed set or indirect pollination to crops like alfalfa, then of course, which help support our cattle and our dairy industries, right? So we're talking about both direct and indirect impacts, right? At
Right.
least 30 billion. And then our native bees, we think we have a more difficult time at tracking those because the majority of our native bees tend to be ground nesters. So they're not quite as easy to be able to find or to count those numbers. But we think that the number is around 6 billion in economic impact of our native bees. And the native bees tend to be more specialist bees, so they have much shorter lifespans compared to honeybees, which, some of our colonies can easily live for 5 to 6 or 7 years. Not so the native bees. Most of them live at most 3 months, 4 months. They're very
Wow.
seasonal and they're very specialized. Their arrival in the spring or summer is timed to very certain specialized crops, like pumpkin bees, right? And or tomatoes. Our bumbles will come out and do buzz pollination of our tomato plants or our blueberry plants. But once that season has ended, then the life of a native bee tends to end as well. So we know less about that aspect of our pollinators, but they're absolutely a critical component of our very complex industrial agriculture in this country.
So you mentioned, I mean, we've talked about commercial beekeepers, but the reality is there's a lot of small beekeepers. But I'd like to kind of transition to the talk, because the native bees, how do we in our own backyards or in our communities help create some of those environments? Like, what do we need to plant in the backyard to actually help promote a bee-friendly environment?
Sure, and that's a great question. I want to start out by first saying a lot of our native bees are they're single moms. Okay. And again, they have very short lifespans compared to, say, a honeybee colony. And so one thing that many homeowners can do is leave bare ground, like a berm or something like that. They tend to be ground nesters because they associate that with safety. And especially in the heat of summer, right? The ground is much cooler for them. That's one thing that they can do. You want to consider providing flowers from early spring, early summer, late summer, early fall, late fall. And I guess I'm partial here to my honeybees, but especially with honeybees, we tend to have a dearth of fall flowers. Um, I say that I'm quite well aware that in Kentucky we have some wonderful varieties of goldenrod, and one of those varieties is actually it's endangered. It's called the Short's goldenrod. It's so critically endangered that the Cincinnati Botanical Garden decided to cultivate it and make a cultivar available to people. And I mention this particular cultivar because it's called Solar Cascade. It handles drought in August and September and moving into October better than any other goldenrod I've ever seen. And it's not as tall because some of our goldenrod, our Canadian goldenrod, can be very tall. Um, but it's just as critical to have early spring plants blooming as well. Um, the other thing I like to remind gardeners to do, because I don't want to come across as being anti-chemical. I'm not. I'm a gardener. For that matter, I'm an orchard owner. I I have to use fungicides, right? If I
Right.
want a quality crop. But there are a couple of things that I do. For instance, I'll mow my orchard and make sure that there are no attractive blooming dandelions in that orchard before we apply the fungicide, right? I like to wait until the end of the day, like dusk, 6 o'clock, so that I'm impacting as few pollinators as possible when I'm doing that. Um, and I also like to remind people that container gardening is just fine. Herbs are wonderful pollinator plants, and if you let like your mint blossom or sage, you will see bees all over those. And, the nice thing about herbs is they can take a lot of neglect. Right?
Right.
They do not need a lot of prissy gardening skills at all. And so anything like rosemary, basil, thyme, those are really good. I mentioned sage, of course, because those particular plants provide blossoms that bees absolutely love. So that's not a lot of money, right? I mean, I think some people think, oh, I have to do a whole acre. No, 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 no. A container garden is just fine. I think sometimes uh, our population has forgotten what an acre really is, which I like to remind people it's about the size of a football field, right?
Right. Well, I'm hearing you and I'm like, check, 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 because I have all these herbs in pots in my backyard. So I'll have to send you some pictures. But that's always flowers as well. But I think that's a good point. And you mentioned before we wrap up, you mentioned the mowing, and that recognize we have to use fungicides, some pesticides. But what's the best way to do that so you're not, you're also protecting the pollinators?
So you don't want to use powders because, and again, it goes back to the fact that bees have hair, right?
Good point.
Yeah.
And when they're flying, those hairs create electricity. So they will add any dust. In fact, one of the most heartbreaking pesticide kill stories. Um, in fact, this family is still in business. But it is heartbreaking. In the late 70s, there was a chemical called PenCap M. It was one of the first micro-encapsulated pesticides to come on the market. And the manufacturers, I don't want to come across as villainizing this manufacturer. The label was clear. And that's the other thing here for your folks. Read the label. It exists for a reason. And the label was clear. Do not apply in the middle of bloom season, right? And or alter your schedule. So this farmer went out and of course he applied it in the middle of bloom, and every single one of this man's hives, when he woke up that morning, he was a fourth generation beekeeper. And in the summer, the sound of the bees working was his soundtrack to his
Right.
life, right? And he walked out and it was silent. And every
Oh,
single one of those foragers had brought back in their pollen baskets that pin cap M, and that got fed to the babies in the hive, right? So,
right.
so if you're going to apply a chemical, I say use a liquid formula. Wait until the end of the day if possible. Um, just try to be cognizant that, these are, um, the bees themselves can't read the label. That's on you, right? And just realize that your actions have impact.
Well, and I think Tammy, you really brought a full circle. It's not only what commercial beekeepers do, but it's also what we as backyard gardeners, whether we're doing herbs, flowers, or a vegetable garden, or smaller farmers too. We all need to be respectful of really the environment for pollinators and especially bees when it comes to the food. So one quick question. Obviously, you've got some beehives, I would say, at home if you've got orchards. So I just want to hear what your favorite like honey or advice if someone's thinking about maybe I'll get a few hives. It takes a little work, but just something. What's a great tip? And when it comes to honey, what do we need to look for?
So I like the darker varietals of honey because they're very complex, right? And it's the flowers that determine the taste, not the bees. So I like, those strong flavors. Buckwheat can be too strong for people. It's almost like sorghum, but I love it in barbecue sauces because I want that extra heartiness. I I don't want a clover honey in a barbecue sauce. I'd rather
Yeah.
have clover honey in my salad dressing, right? To let the different ingredients in the salad shine, right? And not compete, with the honey. Um, but if people are interested, Kentucky is very fortunate. We have over 60 different local beekeeping associations. So first of all, you don't have to be alone. And I like to tell people not to spend a dime on bees or equipment until they have gone to a local beekeeping association for a full year and they can see what they're getting into because it's not for everyone. And you can do just as much good by planting flowers as being a beekeeper, I like to tell people. Um, if so, the Kentucky State Beekeepers Association has a list of those local beekeeping associations, and the Kentucky State Beekeepers Association website is kybees.org. Very easy to find. Membership is only $15 for individual or family. Um, and I hope that people, if they are attending the Kentucky State Fair, will go to the bees and honey section because you can see like 30 different varietals throughout the state. So Western Kentucky honey can taste very differently than Eastern Kentucky honey, and they can purchase it there on site while they're visiting at the expo center. And there are education events offered throughout the year, including at Kentucky State University. So they're welcome to reach out to me. Um, we do have a beginner beekeeping grant, but the funds for 2026 have currently been expended on for this year. But 2027 we'll have funds for beginners, and we also have some other grant opportunities for people who have been beekeeping for a while.
Well, I think you've given us some great ideas, and as a dietitian and a food person, I love the fact that that to expand your selection of honeys. One honey is not a one size fits all. So you've given me some really good food for thought, literally. And the more honey we buy, the better for those who produce it, right? So thank you so much. I think that when we talk about it is that the whole concept of this podcast is to really talk about the story behind food, and you've told a very interesting story that sometimes we don't really think about, how that bee is so important to what we eat. So, whether it's container gardens, herbs, flowers, or just being a consumer of honey, we definitely can help keep our environment truly bee friendly. So here's to good ways to continue to be friendly to those around the bees around us and the environment, so we can continue to enjoy all kinds of food, and especially all our fruits and vegetables. So Tammy, thank you again. You're just a truly fountain of wisdom when it comes to beekeeping, and I'm so glad your pathway led you from English into beekeeping. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Rooted and Restless. It's all about digging deeper into the behind the scenes about food, agriculture, and nutrition, because after all, every food has a story, and sometimes it's not as simple as it seems. Subscribe to Rooted and Restless wherever you listen to podcasts, or find us on YouTube.